Day of the Daleks is, in many ways, a landmark story in classic Doctor Who. It marks the Third Doctor's first confrontation with his most infamous adversaries, and any first meeting between the Doctor and the Daleks is always a notable moment. It had also been 5 years since the Daleks last appeared on television, following 1967's Evil of the Daleks. Their return in 1972 therefore carried real weight. And this story would also mark their first appearance on television in colour, excluding, of course, the two 1960s feature films starring Peter Cushing. So on paper, Day of the Daleks has all the ingredients of a major event. The return of the show's greatest villains, a new Doctor facing them for the first time, and the Daleks finally appearing in colour on television. But do these milestones actually translate into a great story? Does the finished product justify its landmark status? Was this truly a triumphant return for the Daleks, or did the execution fall short of the ambition? Let's take a closer look at Day of the Daleks, and ask the question, was this Dalek story a big failure, or a successful return to form? As already mentioned, Day of the Daleks marked the Daleks' first return to television since the second Doctor adventure, Evil of the Daleks, in 1967. That story had been presented as the final end of the Daleks, seemingly bringing Dalekmania to a close as the Cybermen became the dominant adversary for the Second Doctor era. But 5 years later, producer Barry Letts and script editor Terence Dicks felt enough time had passed to bring the Daleks back into the fold. The Cybermen had already been rested, and audiences had just been treated to an entire season featuring the newly established Master. There was also a practical reason for the Daleks' return. The whole setup of the Doctor Who Third Doctor era centres around the Doctor being exiled on 20th century Earth. While this grounded the series and allowed for the introduction of UNIT, it also meant many stories were confined to a single contemporary setting. After 2 seasons, those limitations were beginning to show. Without occasionally bending the rules or introducing a truly impactful villain, the format risked becoming repetitive. Bringing back the Daleks for Season 9, therefore, made perfect sense. Day of the Daleks was eventually chosen as the opening story of Season 9, designed to kick off the new season with a bang. But interestingly, that wasn't the original plan. Dalek creator Terry Nation was unavailable to submit a script, so the production team considered another idea, a story titled Daleks in London by Robert Sloman, which would have served as the season finale. However, the concept immediately echoed memories of the first Doctor story, The Dalek Invasion of Earth, and the idea was quickly abandoned. Still determined to bring the Daleks back, however, the production team decided instead to repurpose an existing story submission. Writer Louis Marks had already submitted a script with several working titles, including The Ghost Hunters and Years of Doom. It was a story built around time travellers and paradoxes, and the production team realised that with some rewriting it could easily accommodate the Daleks. And with that, Day of the Daleks was born. The Daleks, now written into Louis Marks' script, now retitled the familiar Day of the Daleks. Everything appeared to be in place for a story of epic proportions, fitting for the Doctor's greatest adversaries. The narrative centres on a group of resistance fighters travelling back in time from the 22nd century. Their mission is to assassinate Sir Reginald Styles, a British diplomat they believe is responsible for triggering a devastating war, one that ultimately allows the Daleks to conquer the Earth. As the story unfolds, events bounce between the 20th century and an alternative 22nd century future. The Doctor must work out how to prevent this grim timeline from coming to pass, whilst also uncovering how it connects to an upcoming peace conference chaired by Styles in the present day. Even that basic outline suggests a story operating on a huge scale. 2 time periods, a looming global conflict in the present, and a dystopian future in which the Daleks have finally achieved their long-term goal of successfully invading the Earth. The narrative also fits in neatly with the political themes that were already familiar in the Third Doctor era of Doctor Who, but it goes even further by introducing a devastated future Earth, echoing the kind of alternate timeline storytelling seen in the other Third Doctor story, Inferno. All of this immediately suggests a story with enormous ambition. And then there's the finale. The idea of the Daleks, now supported by their brutal henchmen, the Ogrons, clashing directly with UNIT practically promises an explosive climax. It conjures memories of the large-scale battles seen early in stories such as The Invasion, or even Third Doctor adventures like Spearhead from Space, The Ambassadors of Death, and Terror of the Autons. With all these elements in play, you might even begin to wonder how such an ambitious story could possibly be contained within its allocated 4 episodes. If anything, many Third Doctor stories are criticised for being too long. Yet here, Day of the Daleks almost sounds like it might not have enough time to tell its story. Because when you describe many classic Doctor Who stories purely by their narrative intentions, they often sound enormous, epic, almost cinematic in scale. But it is so often the case with classic Doctor Who. The reality of TV production can sometimes be very different from the original ambition. To Dalek stories of the 1960s. Their debut outing, The Daleks, followed by stories like The Dalek Invasion of Earth, The Chase, The Daleks Master Plan, Power of the Daleks, and The Evil of the Daleks. All of them, in one way or another, carry a sense of scale and gravitas, whether through their multiple locations, their large cast, or simply the implied presence of Daleks in overwhelming numbers. They create the impression of a vast and unstoppable force. And on paper, Dave the Dalek seems no different. But once production began, the team encountered a major problem. They only had 3 Dalek props available. Because this was the first Dalek story to be produced for colour television, those aging props needed significant refurbishment. After being repainted, their classic silver and blue colour scheme was replaced with a darker gunmetal grey design, a look that would carry on through the rest of the classic series, alongside a distinctive gold Dalek to signify their leader. Visually, Daleks look refreshed for their colour television debut. But the production team now face an obvious question. How do you convincingly portray the Daleks conquering Earth with only 3 of them? This wasn't actually a new problem. Earlier stories, particularly The Power of the Daleks, had used clever filming techniques to give the illusion of larger Dalek numbers. Cardboard cutouts could populate the background, whilst the same props were moved around off-screen and reintroduced from different angles to create the impression of many more Daleks than actually existed. But those tricks had worked largely because the show was filmed in black and white, which naturally concealed some visual details. Now working in colour, those same techniques were far harder to disguise. As a result, much of the action instead falls to the Ogrons. While the idea of Daleks employing henchmen wasn't new, we'd already seen that with the Robo-Men in the Dalek Invasion of Earth, their prominence here changes the balance of the story. Narratively, the Ogrons become the primary enforcers. They're the ones sent to deal with the resistance fighters, confront UNIT, and maintain order in the devastated 22nd century Earth. Meanwhile, the Daleks themselves largely remain hidden away in their control tower, ruling indirectly through the seemingly human authority of the controller. The result is that, for much of the story, the Daleks feel strangely distant. Their iconic cry of exterminate is heard surprisingly rarely, and they don't actually kill anyone on screen until the final episode. For villains who are supposed to dominate the planet, their presence can feel surprisingly restrained. And when that long-anticipated Dalek showdown in the 20th century finally arrives, the result is somewhat underwhelming. Director Paul Bernard attempts to film the Daleks in ways to imply larger numbers, but the illusion rarely convinces. The battle itself was shot on location, and the Dalek props were notoriously difficult to maneuver on uneven outdoor terrain. As a result, the Daleks often appear almost stationary and static during what is supposed to be an epic confrontation, while once again the Ogrons do most of the fighting. For a series that had already delivered large-scale unit action in stories like The Invasion and Terror of the Autons, the climax feels surprisingly small. And then there was one final problem: the Daleks' voices. By this point, the distinctive, electronically distorted voices created by Peter Hawkins, David Graham, and Roy Skelton have become just as iconic as the Daleks' visual design. But for Day the Daleks, none of those actors were used due to personal preferences from the director. Instead, the voices were performed by Oliver Gilbert and Peter Messerline. The result is a noticeably different, quieter, less aggressive, and lacking some of the menace that audiences have come to associate with the Daleks. And for many viewers, that subtle difference takes some of the bite out of their long-awaited return. As mentioned earlier on, The Daleks were actually a late addition to the original plot of Day of the Daleks. The story had already been conceived before they were written in, which is why the title itself changed during development. And when watching the finished story, the late addition is surprisingly noticeable. In many ways, the narrative could easily function without the Daleks at all. Yes, their presence adds a certain gravitas to the antagonist's role, but the story could just as easily have featured another villain. The Master, the Cybermen, or even a completely new antagonist could arguably have filled the same narrative space. The impact might have been different, but the core story itself would not necessarily have been weaker. But, despite the issues with the Daleks, the limited number of props, the unusual voices, and their restricted presence on screen, the underlying narrative of Day of the Daleks is actually very strong. The concept of resistance fighters travelling back in time to prevent the creation of their own dystopian future is a fantastic idea. The three rebels, Anat, Boaz, and Shura, feel believable as desperate fighters from a conquered Earth, driven by fear and determination as they attempt to assassinate Sir Reginald Styles. The Ogrons are also an effective addition. While they might struggle to carry a story as the primary villain, they work well as brutal enforcers. Their intimidating presence helps give the future Earth sequences a real sense of oppression, and they will later return to similar effect in Frontier in Space. And beyond that, it's actually quite surprising that they've never appeared again in Doctor Who since. Then, there's the character of the Controller. Although he ultimately serves the Daleks, he is far more complex than a typical puppet ruler. Played by Aubrey Woods, who many viewers might recognise as the Candyman in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, Controller is portrayed as a deeply conflicted man. To those around him, he appears as an authoritarian and demanding, but this facade gradually reveals itself as the result of immense pressure from the Daleks themselves. Woods gives the character a surprising charm as well, particularly in the scene where he casually extracts information from Jo about the time period she has come from after she is transported to the 22nd century. And ultimately, his encounter with the Doctor forces him to confront the truth, that he has merely been a puppet of the Daleks all along, leading to his eventual downfall. Then, of course, there is the Doctor himself. John Pertwee famously said that he disliked the Daleks and didn't particularly enjoy working with them, a sentiment that was actually shared by a number of actors and directors over the years. Yet despite that, Pertwee appears to be having tremendous fun throughout the story. His chemistry with the regular cast, particularly Jo Grant, is wonderful. Whether it's indulging in red wine and gorgonzola while investigating the supposed ghosts, or forcefully confronting the controller and challenging him to recognise his moral responsibility, John Pertwee is definitely enjoying himself here. But when it finally comes to the long-awaited meeting between the Daleks and the Doctor, the result feels surprisingly limited. The Doctor doesn't even encounter a Dalek until halfway through the story, and by the time he is finally captured and interrogated by them in the final episode, their interaction is brief and lacks the dramatic weight you might expect from such a moment. For a story marking the Third Doctor's first encounter with the Daleks, there is surprisingly little direct conflict between them. With the Doctor only discovering the Daleks' involvement late in the narrative, there simply isn't enough time for that anticipated confrontation to develop. And once again, this raises the same question. Were the Daleks really necessary to the story at all? The whole purpose of this video has been to answer the central question. Was Day of the Daleks a big failure? Well, no. It certainly isn't a big failure, but it does fall short in several key areas that could have elevated it into something much stronger. The limited number of Dalek props, their restricted presence on screen, and the fact that they were ultimately a late addition to the narrative all works against them. This story was supposed to mark the Daleks' big comeback, their first appearance in the Third Doctor era, their arrival in the 1970s, and their first appearance on television in colour. With expectations like that resting on the story's shoulders, the Daleks themselves are something of a disappointment. From that perspective, Day of the Daleks could be seen as a missed opportunity. There is also an important factor worth considering. Very few members of the production team had any prior experience working with the Daleks. Producer Barry Letts had never produced a Dalek story. Writer Louis Marks had never written a Dalek story before or since. Script editor Terence Dix had never overseen one. Director Paul Bernard had never directed them either. And among the main cast, Only Nicholas Courtney had previously appeared in a Dalek story, and even then it was in a completely different role from the Brigadier. The production team were essentially learning, therefore, how to handle Daleks as they went along. Techniques that had worked in the 1960s simply didn't translate as well into the 1970s, particularly with the transition to colour television. But to their credit, the team clearly learned from their experience. The Daleks would return 3 more times during the Third Doctor era. They appeared alongside the Master at the climax of Frontier in Space, providing a rare and intriguing alliance between two of the Doctor's greatest enemies. Planet of the Daleks presented them in much greater numbers, with the production team experimenting with new techniques to create a more convincing Dalek force. And Death to the Daleks explored the Daleks' cunning and adaptability when their usual power was restricted. As for Day the Daleks itself, the narrative at its core is actually very strong. Strong enough, in fact, that the Daleks sometimes feel almost secondary to the story being told. The time travel paradox at the heart of the plot is generally compelling. The characters are engaging, the dystopian future setting is memorable, and the story blends classic science fiction ideas with the subtle reflections of the political anxieties of the early 1970s. In many ways, Day the Daleks contains all the ingredients for a traditionally great Doctor Who story, just not necessarily a great Dalek story. But regardless of modern opinion, the story clearly succeeded with audiences at the time. Episode 2 attracted 10.4 million viewers, the first time Doctor Who had passed the 10 million mark since, ironically, Episode 3 The Daleks Master Plan more than 6 years earlier. The Daleks were back, and the audiences responded. In fact, Day the Daleks helped kick off what could have been seen as a second wave of Dalekmania, one that had continued throughout the early 1970s and eventually culminate in the Fourth Doctor classic, Genesis of the Daleks. Personally, though, I've never felt that the Third Doctor era truly produced a definitive Dalek story. Planet of the Daleks, which marked the return of Dalek creator Terry Nation, is often seen as something of a reworking of the original 1963 story. And Death to the Daleks famously places the Daleks in situations where they almost feel like cannon fodder. Perhaps that's simply because the Third Doctor's Dalek stories sit between some of the greatest Dalek stories ever made. But whatever the reason, they never quite reach the same heights. So, Day of the Daleks. A big failure? No. A missed opportunity to bring the Daleks back with greater impact? Probably. But despite its flaws, it remains a solid Doctor Who story. One that really didn't need the Daleks in the first place, yet still succeeded in bringing them back into the public spotlight. And in doing so, it ensured that the Daleks would once again become one of the defining forces of the series. But tell me, what do you think? Is Day the Daleks one of your favourite Dalek stories? Let me know in the comments below. But for now, it's the end. The moment has been prepared for.